John Smith may be one of the most famous of the early American explorers. He was a leader of the first permanent English colony to remain in America, a tireless explorer of the Chesapeake region, and a habitual self-promoter. Smith would have never had the opportunity to do these things except for several critical instants in his earlier life. Many may know him from the Disney story Pocahontas, in which he is a tall, handsome aristocrat who wanted peace and friendship with the Indians in Virginia. This caricature of Smith was far from an accurate depiction. From his physical appearance to his demeanor, John Smith in real life was far from a Disney prince. John Smith, that is popularly known, holds little resemblance to the historical figure. We will discover how John Smith came to the top of English society and was entrusted with a leadership role in the Jamestown colony. Through his own words, in his book The True Travels, Adventures, and Observations of Captain John Smith in Europe, Asia, Africa, and America, which was first published in 1629, as well as more modern scholarship, we will explore John as he was, not as the fictions tell. We will dispel some myths about the man that have cropped up over the past 400 years and learn the incredible story of an amazing adventurer. Get ready to meet the real John Smith. John Smith was born probably in 1580 in Willoughby, Lincolnshire. His parents died when he was 13 years old, and he promptly sold his personal belongings with the intent of taking to sea. However, as he says, they left him with liberty enough, though no means to get beyond the sea. It was some years before he was able to become a seaman, but even with this, we can see Smith's tenacity to achieve his goals. He was apprenticed to Mr. Thomas Sendall, the greatest merchant of all those parts, according to Smith. But John quickly became frustrated because the merchant would not send him to sea. Maybe he deemed Smith a flight risk, or maybe Sendall simply wished for John to learn the business for which he was apprenticed. Whatever the case, Smith eventually signed on to the retinue of Peregrine Barty, the second son of Lord Willoughby, and they took off to France. Smith's connection to the Lords Willoughby is important in his life, as connections to the gentry of his homeland opened many doors otherwise closed during his travels. Smith admitted that he was surplus as a servant, so he was sent back to London. This likely came about when Lord Willoughby realized one of his retainers of his son was one of his subjects that was supposed to be elsewhere, apprenticed for gainful employ rather than as a playmate. Smith was not in control of his own funds due to his age, so £10 was deducted from the money his parents had left him, and Lord Willoughby gave it to him in Paris for the purpose of travel to London. Smith indeed used the money for travel, but instead of London he hopped a ship to Scotland to deliver some letters for a different acquaintance. Finding himself low on funds already, Smith went promptly to Havre de Grace and signed on with Captain Joseph Duxbury. Duxbury was an English mercenary captain who headed a company of soldiers that was bound for the Netherlands. In the Low Countries, the 80 Years' War was fully boiled over. Also called the Dutch Revolt, the Dutch Republic had declared independence from the Spanish Habsburg King Philip II in 1572. During the Long War, both sides hired many foreign troops, which is why Duxbury and his men, with the still teenage John Smith in tow, were off to the Netherlands. All we know is that John served well in the war for at least 3 years, eventually returning to England. From our modern perspective, we can clearly see that John Smith was probably suffering from a form of combat PTSD. He became glutted with too much company in his hometown of Willoughby and avoided any bustle of civilized England. Wherein he took small delight, he retired himself into a woody pasture, a good way from any town, environed with many hundred acres of other woods. Here by the fair brook he built a pavilion of boughs, where only in his clothes did he lay. His study was Machiavel's art of war and Marcus Aurelius. His exercise a good horse, with his lance and ring. His food was thought to be more of venison than anything else. The worried locals soon sent Theodore Palaeologus, himself a famous warrior and assassin, to see what the reclusive John was doing alone in the woods. Theodore was a Greek-Italian nobleman directly descended from the late rulers of Byzantium. Due to the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, Theodore's family was forced into exile, and he hired himself out as a sword and horseman. Palaeologus was in Lincoln as the official master of horse to the Earl of Lincoln. whose seat was Tattersall, but it is likely the exiled emperor was used as a spy and assassin. John admired Palaeologus, and when Theodore invited Smith to stay with him at Tattersall, John accepted the offer. Whether through boredom or tutelage from an old pro, Smith outgrew his need to avoid crowds and returned to the Low Countries for more war. It is very much probable that Palaeologus, through the tales of his own past adventure and lineage, planted the seed in John's mind to take the cross for a late-era crusade. John's experience after combat is little different from a modern veteran that retired to the forest with little around him but peace, books, and work, coaxed out of the solitude only by others that had also experienced trauma and war. Smith eventually decided he had had enough of killing fellow Christians in the Netherlands, so he decided to take up arms against the Muslim invaders of Europe, the Turkish Ottomans. To aid him on his long journey, Smith teamed up with those who he came to call the Four French Gallants. The four Frenchmen convinced John that they were all headed east for the same reason, and if only he would join them, the Duchess of Mercury would write them each letters of introduction and favor to her husband, the Duke, who was then the lead general for the Emperor of Hungary. John agreed that steady companionship and glowing recommendations would be beneficial when he reached the Eastern European battlefields. One night, his French companions convinced the ship's master to heave into a shallow inlet in Picardy. The gallants then unloaded the travel trunks of all on board and left John asleep in the hold. When John awoke, he found his companions and the boat's master missing. Rather than allow the master to return to the ship with the boat's launch, the Frenchmen had murdered him, which stranded John aboard at high tide. Finally ashore, John found one of the men, Curzon Vere, who quickly admitted that they were neither nobles nor lords, and if John would only keep him alive, he could take him to the others. With Curzon Vere, who was cast out by his friends as well, John hunted the other three, eventually catching up with the leader called Depro in Caen. John scattered the remaining men, and relying on the kindness of well-to-do persons and gentry in Normandy, continued to hunt each man down. Several times he nearly froze or starved to death, but was nursed back to health by a wealthy farmer in Brittany, until finally he encountered Courcelle, the last man of the group. They dueled in full view of an inhabited defensive tower, and after John wounded Courcelle badly, he explained to the gathering crowd the reason for the fight. All seemed to have understood the reasons and fully excused Smith and imprisoned Courcelle to hand him over to the authorities. This experience is the first glimpse at his dogged personality. John Smith will stop at nothing to accomplish a goal or to right a wrong done to him. Having dealt with the thieves, John turned south towards the Mediterranean. Relying on old war companions also in the region, including the Earl of Plover, he outfitted himself for the long trip to Hungary. John traveled by land, maybe discouraged by his last sea voyage along the Bay of Biscay down to the Spanish frontier into Marseille. He boarded a ship intended for Rome, but bad weather and high seas convinced the French sailors and Catholic pilgrims headed for Rome, hourly cursing him, not for only for a Huguenot, but his nation they swore were all pirates, and so vilely railed on his dread sovereign Queen Elizabeth, and that they should never have fair weather as long as he was aboard them. So they threw him overboard near enough a small island that he didn't drown, and spent the rest of the night in a company of its only other inhabitants, cows and goats. He managed to hail a passing ship, the Bretagne, the next morning, and luckily enough the captain was a friend of none other than the Earl of Plover, one of John's benefactors during his French ordeal. The two got along very well, and John decided to stay on, despite his destination only being Rome. From the French coast, the ship skirted the North African shore more to view what ships were in the road than anything else, foreshadowing what the true intent of the captain was. The ship dropped their cargo in Egypt, and still John stayed aboard. On their return from Egypt, a Venetian ship came within calling distance, and the Bretagne's captain began speaking to the Venetian. Slaughter followed. John recounts how the Bretagne gave them the broadside, then the stern, and his other broadside also, and continued the chase with his chase pieces. When the Bretagne attempted to board the Venetian set the assaulting pirate ship afire. After the blaze was put out, the Venetian surrendered. The Bretagne had lost 15 men and the Venetian 20. The fight was worth it though. John and his new crew of pirates seized expensive bolts of silk, velvet, cloth of gold, and tissue, as well as international collections of gold and silver coins, including piastres, chickweens, and sultanes. It took an entire 24 hours to unload the spoils. The Venetian was such a large, richly laden vessel that John estimated that it would take another Bretagne-sized ship to carry the remainder of the goods they left behind. The captain of the Bretagne led John off the Italian coast with 500 chickweens and a little box worth as much again. John decided to take a land route across Italy towards the Turkish wars in the east and didn't seem in much of a hurry to reach battle. Along the way, he again met up with the Lord of Willoughby, who was recovering from wounds he took in battle. John described seeing Pope Clement VIII celebrate Catholic Mass in Rome, and visited Florence, Bologna, and even Venice. He traveled to Dubrovnik across the Adriatic from Italy and headed north through what he calls Albania and Dalmatia, but is now Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia. By now, John the traveling pirate had reached his goal, the battlefields against the Turkish army. A point on the history of what is now modern Hungary and Romania must be made before we continue. The Ottoman Turks were a Muslim empire and had begun invading Europe through this region in the late 1500s. Real effort was made by regional Christians to push them out, but just as many noble Christians turned cloak and sided with the new power. So the call went out across Christendom for a new crusade. While there were many volunteers that came from the west, there was no official effort made by Rome to reclaim the territory. Not only were crusades considered folly after the many expensive failures of the past centuries, the Christian church had also split into factions of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. No doctrinal schism was very willing to help the other, even with what all considered to be the greater evil at their gates. John witnessed this himself when he was thrown from a storm-tossed ship by Catholics fearing his Protestant soul angered God enough to punish them all for carrying him. The Christian armies themselves were infighting as well. For example, the voivodes of Transylvania would change voivode every few years depending on the successes of the war against the Ottomans. This was done by battle, vote, by Transylvanian nobility, not the populace, or just plain political backbiting. Some voivodes were ardent patriots for their land and refused to claim fealty to the Turkish Ottomans. Others were more pragmatic and sided with their Muslim overlords. A historical example of this infighting was the famous Dracula clan head Vlad II, the infamous Vlad the Impaler's father. He gave both his sons to the Ottomans as hostages in order to support his rule. Vlad, we know Vlad III as the Dracula, became anti-Ottoman, but his other hostage brother Radu converted to Islam and fought for the Ottomans to control Wallachia. Either way, John entered this turbulent war with great fortitude. Once Smith had reached Vienna, he signed on with the Earl of Meldrich in a mercenary company bound to break the Turkish siege of the town of Olympal. It was this battle which earned John his rank of Captain John Smith. As he tells it, John invented a sort of visual code with the use of torches, much like semaphore in later centuries, where he could deliver a message to his general from a mountaintop about the disposition of the Turkish forces. The Turks earlier had surprised the opposing army at this Olympal because the Christians had no military intelligence of any kind. So John devised the code, climbed a nearby mountain, and later organized the strategy for the battle that broke the siege. He was given a company of 250 cavalrymen as a reward. Now as Captain Smith, John's company pushed east along with the rest of the Christian army and chased the broken Turks. In 1601, they arrived at the city now called Szekelyesvár in Hungary, but was then called Stol-Wiesenberg, or Alba Regalis. The Turks sallied out of the besieged city and killed 500 of the Christian army. By 1601, the city had been in Muslim hands for over 30 years, and many of the locals held allegiance to these masters. The strongly fortified city would be difficult to break, and the Turks again raided the Christian lines and killed or captured near 1,000 more men. Again, John came to the rescue by building dragons, which were clay pots filled with gunpowder and coated with pitch, turpentine, and brimstone, then had musket balls affixed to the sticky coating and were finally wrapped with cloth and gun lighting match. By this description, they seem to be the same as fire pots or grenados of pirates and seafarers from later centuries. These pots were hurled by sling at midnight into the camps of the Turks, and it was a fearful sight to see the short flaming course of their flight in the air. But presently after their fall, the lamentable noise of the miserable slaughtered Turks was most wonderful to hear. Besides, they had fired that suburb at the port of Buda in 2 or 3 places, which so troubled the Turks to quench that had there been any means to have assaulted them, they could hardly have resisted the fire and their enemies. The Christians attacked during the firestorm and managed to capture the city, as well as the Muslim commander. Credit for victory was largely given to the fire, and in turn the man who made the fire possible. Once Alba Regalis was retaken from the Turks, Smith's regiment was sent to Transylvania. Upon leaving the city, the Christian army encountered a massive Muslim force sent by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet III. However, the Muslim forces arrived piecemeal and were each segregated and destroyed regiment by regiment. John makes a point to describe how he had his horse slain under him and himself sore wounded, but he was not long unmounted, for there was choice enough of horses that wanted masters. During the following march to Transylvania through enemy territory, the Christian army was harassed regularly by swift Muslim horsemen. John devised several guerrilla methods to deal with these attacks. For one, he convinced the commander to pitch camp in an area which was indefensible to horses. After nightfall, when the inevitable attack came, the Christian men stood ready. The Muslim force was encircled and all 500 men were killed. No quarter was given, and survivors did not live long enough to be called prisoner. Muslim harassment ended that night, again due to one of John Smith's cunning ideas.